So for this ContinuuCon, I thought about kind of continuing a little bit of what I presented last year, but it also shouldn't be too much based on that, because I know, of course, there are many people here who weren't there last year. So this is not too much. This doesn't require having been at the previous ContinuuCon as a prerequisite, so you can understand this perfectly well without it. And I'm obviously going to concentrate more on how to pitch shift voice, and therefore I will just briefly run through what pitch shifting through granular synthesis actually means. And let me just start presentation mode on this one. Okay. So you may ask, what's the whole point of pitch shifting? Apart from being a funny exercise to do on the continuum because it's possible, it's also to play any kind of sound that you get in through your AES input. So you can basically play chords with anything you want in real time. And that's basically what I presented last year, at a preset that could do that for anything. But you run into problems when you do that on a human voice, because it doesn't sound natural. And this presentation will address that thing. And what this means is basically that you have parallel pitch shifting going on. So if you play a chord, you take the input and you pitch shift it multiple times to the chord you are playing. So that's basically in all its simplicity how it works. And you could do it for correcting pitch, but that's not the point. Of course, if you don't use rounding, you could in real time correct the pitch of somebody singing or something like that. But you have to be obviously very skilled if you do that. And even more so if they are singing chords.
Then they're skilled. All three of them.
So, one reason why this was also interesting to present now was that this couldn't be done without multiple DSPs. So it's a nice showcase of what you can do if you have more than one DSP in your instrument. And it will be clear very soon to you why two DSPs are needed. But first, about granular synthesis, what it actually means. I did present a bit of this last year, but this time I also included a visual analogy of what it means. So this is actually more understandable than my presentation from last year, I would say. But mainly the word granular synthesis comes from the fact that you are splitting your input sound into small snippets or chunks, and you can rearrange them in either frequency or time or both. And if you randomize them temporarily, then you get kind of a cloud of grains, which merge together into a continuous sound. And this is what this visual analogy tries to express. So you have your original signal. Those colors are just indicating something changing over time. But you should look at it visually now. And you want to achieve the second one. But when you resample, which in practice is like playing back at higher or lower speed, then what happens is that it also changes the length of the sample. So then you end up with a gap, as in this case, where this illustrates a pitch shift upwards of 1 octave. Then it becomes twice as high, frequency content becomes twice as high, but it's also only half the length of what it used to be. And then you would need to fill in the gap by, for example, looping, which doesn't sound nice, except of course if you want that kind of effect. So what you can do then is the essence of granular synthesis, and that's dividing, resampling, and multiplying and rearranging, and then mixing everything together again. And this visually illustrates how you can get, let's say, temporarily the same kind of sound as you originally had, but pitch shifted 1 octave higher. And obviously you need more grains than if you just divide everything into short snippets, then to fill in all those gaps, you need more of them than you originally had when you divided your input sound. So obviously you can do this by just, okay, Ed and Lippold can tell you what's actually happening in the DSP. But this is the basic principle how it's done, and it takes the input from the delay line, which is in the matrix anyway. And here is now kind of an illustration of the voice delay, which is the source storage for this audio, which is treated. And the change from last year is basically just that the same principle is applied, but now, because of the peculiar features of human voice, it sounds much better if it's split into two parallel processing streams. And this needs two DSPs to work. And just as in the previous example from last year, here also you can set a reference note, and anything you play will be in relation to that reference note. So if you play the reference note, it won't pitch shift at all. 1/5 higher will pitch shift 1/5 higher, and so on. And there is actually in the original instructions for the matrix, they actually included quite some hints about how this granular synthesis works. And this is maybe not so clear in the current generation of instructions, but I have the old ones also. So occasionally I checked from the old one that what did this particular input actually mean for granular synthesis. But it's you can do quite much with the inputs you have there. And this is now, of course, called harmonic manipulator. Some challenges with these choices of grain lengths. Obviously, a grain has to be long enough to contain several cycles, because otherwise you kind of lose your frequency. It becomes like when you let's say gate a signal so that you have less than, for example, one cycle included, then your frequency spectrum spreads out more and more, and in the end you just get an impulse which is a kind of flat frequency spectrum which has absolutely no tonal information anymore. So you need a long enough delay to include many cycles, and also preferably fading in and fading out, because you need to smooth those grains. But you also don't want them too long, because then you start, especially if you have something which is changing quite rapidly, like consonants in speech or singing, then you can sometimes hear that they are doubled or looped if you have too long grains. So a kind of good compromise was, at least in my experimentation, I found that I liked 100 milliseconds best for this application. Also, of course, downsampling will be activated in the DSP of the continuum if you choose very long delay lengths. Here now, part of kind of what I already said, but there's also one additional parameter you can use. So for example, if you use the Y dimension, you can control how tonal your result is going to be. So if you start from Y0 and go towards 1, then it becomes more and more spread out in the frequency domain, and at the uppermost extreme, it's just like a cluster of notes. So this allows you to do quite interesting effects if you like to do more modernist stuff. Now we come to the root of the problem. So human voice is something we all hear all the time. So we are very, very sensitive to it, and we might think of the frequency of the fundamental as the most important thing, which it is in when you do music, but there's so much more than that. So if you don't have the so-called formants present, then you can't distinguish one vowel from another. And formants are basically peaks in the frequency spectrum caused by your vocal cords, and these resonance peaks are caused by your vocal tract, your nose cavity, your mouth cavity, the position of everything, all the organs you use to produce your voice. So if the formants aren't there, we don't distinguish vowels from it, we can't tell vowels from each other, but also if they are somehow unnatural, we react to that very strongly. And as you can see here, the location in the frequency domain of these formants depend on the size of your vocal tract, which in turn depends usually quite strongly on the size of your head, which in turn quite strongly on the size of you. So if you are a child, you will have your formants at a higher frequency range than women, which in turn have their formants a little bit higher than men. So there's much more variation in the fundamental than in the formants, as you can see there. And that's why if we pitch shift the formants too much, it doesn't sound like a human anymore. So this is basically the problem. Here's some diagram showing different vowels in English and the location of first and second formant. There's a third one also, which is down below these. So this illustrates that if you try to just pitch shift without any attention to the formants, in this example by a ratio of 3:2, which is 1/5 higher, then what happens is that your formants are transformed by the same ratio, so that means that the person's head becomes more than 30% smaller in effect at the same time. And this is precisely what people keep calling the chipmunk effect. It has some other names also. I don't know what would be the most official one. I've also heard munchkinization, and I guess there are a few others. So how to deal with this then? What is needed is separate processing for two streams of audio, one for the formants, which is number 2 here, and then one for everything else. And there's actually also a third one, and one is divided into A and B. The reason is that if you go really high, way above 5 kilohertz, then you don't have much there anymore for vowels, but consonants are very strong in that region because s is just high frequency noise. And you have a lot of information there for those. And your fundamental is in region 1A. You can see I've overlaid it on this diagram of fundamentals and formants. Region number 2 is the most tricky, and it has to mix well into the upper regions. That's why this is looking a little bit complex. But the main thing is that you need different amounts of pitch shifting for different regions, and less for region 2 than you need for the other ones. Here's a little diagram of what you can do on 2 DSPs. I must say that okay, these parameters that you see here, they could be made adjustable, but they were mostly fine through experimentation. Originally, I started looking at where formants are and tried to use frequencies based on the diagram I showed you earlier, but that didn't work very well. There was too much chipmunk effect coming through, so I had to shift the whole formant frequency range, treated like formants. I have to shift that up to about 5 kilohertz high cutoff frequency. So it wasn't like 300 to 3.5 kilohertz or whatever I had in the first diagram. And you can see also here that they are quite similar, but there is one important difference. One is of course basically doing band stop filtering and treating just the lowest and highest frequencies. That is what is done in DSP1, and then DSP2 handles the formant region, and it's also doing some additional filtering here. But there is some randomization which has to be done in addition to just dividing frequency ranges. And obviously, if you try to pitch shift one region, but let's say the fundamental and the high frequency region, but not the formant region, then you get kind of contradictory information, because you have one sense of pitch in the low frequency region. You can hear the fundamental, but then your formant region is quite wide, and there are a lot of harmonics there. And if those are not smeared enough by randomization, then you will hear two pitches, and they will usually be dissonant, of course, because if you just maintain the formants and you play whatever pitch shift whatever in the fundamental, you can end up with any kind of unmusical interval. So what has to be done is actually this kind of thing. And you can see here on the left, that's what it looks like originally. Then you kind of filter out the rest, so you end up with some subset of those lines on the left. And then thanks to the noise generator in the matrix and the fact that you can control the stretching, I think it was called S input in the matrix harmonic manipulator, you can randomize them. So then you end up with this kind of non-tonal cluster of frequencies in the center, which in turn approaches shaped noise. And shaped noise is what you get if you whisper. Those are different vowels, but they are just whispered. They don't have any harmonics. And this is shaped noise, what you have there on the right side. But if you really try to nitpick, then it might be that this preset, these parameters I showed you, these frequencies, should be slightly changed for a female voice, and especially for a child's voice, it would have to be different, because they are quite different from adult voices. So the frequencies might be different, but the basic principle is the same. And what you do here, let's say the downside of this processing is what I mentioned here in the last sentence, that it starts sounding breathy. So it's like your voice is leaking a little bit. But if you do sing close to your kind of most comfortable range, and you pitch shift down and up from that one, then I would say, when I started, I thought, okay, can I make this sound even close to natural? So I would say I was positively surprised by the result. But of course, I assume that there are tools on the market that do even better and maybe even much better work at pitch shifting human voice, because if they kind of do analysis and resynthesis, and they have some actual model of sound generation in your vocal tract, then it can recreate the whole thing. But this isn't doing that. It's just two different streams of pitch shifting. And if you look at, I could show it from the editor as well, of course, but this is just what DSP1 looks like. So you can see quite a lot of filters, and voice delay is playing the main role, and then harmonic manipulator is doing the actual granular resynthesis. And then DSP2 is very similar. It's just different parameters for the filters. And you can see also that up here there's one input which has a full, okay, you don't see the cursor here on the screen, but you can see input I on harmonic manipulator 1 has a full one of noise input, so it's as much randomization as it can have. And I'm now going to play just some samples I have embedded into the presentation, and it's just a short phrase sung on one single note. You will also hear it in the demonstration piece I have coming after this one. But let's check now what kind of volume level we have here. That was processed voice. And if I now play DSP1 and DSP2 separately, you can get some idea about what's actually happening. So this is just the non-formant region. And in that one you could already hear a little bit of chipmunk effect. It was attenuated, but you could hear it. And but fortunately, when you add the formant region processed properly, which means just a few % of pitch shifting, you may ask, okay, why a few %? It's because if you look at, I was thinking about the choir, so if you look at singers, normally really people with really low voices tend to be on average a little bit taller than people with very high voices. So if you make some kind of, I don't have any scientific data for this, but just intuitively, if you look at some distribution of vocal tract sizes, I'm quite sure that there's a little bit of correlation, so that you tend to have, on average, a little bit larger vocal tracts in people having low voices. And so this should be reflected also in your processing, because that way you can ensure it sounds most natural. So if I play now just the formant region, you will hear that it's more like a whisper. No tonal information, as you can hear. And you wouldn't think that this would be usable, but when you blend them together, you end up with this. And now I'm quite much ahead of time, which is nice. So, okay, it's replaying it for some reason. I need to restart the presentation, I guess. So let's jump to the final page. So here I have, those of you who are in the Continuum users group have probably most already seen this one. It's a video using this technique. Video is just illustrating the text. So I guess since we are quite much ahead of time, we might be able to listen to this one. Let's say, how many have not heard and seen this before? I think many enough that I will just play it. It should be 4 point something minutes. So this is all Continuum, and it's just a short Latin text whose literal meaning is, let me think, how can things so varied be if formed of fire, single and pure? It sounds quite religious, but I'm agnostic, so you shouldn't read too much into that. Maybe it's actually a scientific explanation from Mr. Lucretius Carus about he was way ahead of his time in thinking scientifically about the universe. It's from 50 BC as far as I remember, but it basically addresses the like in the ancient world, people were thinking about fire and these basic elements. So this is just one sentence from this big literary piece called De Rerum Natura. Everything is Continuum plus voice, of course.
nam curtam parie, es consequenste requiro ex uno si sunt digni ex uno ex uno si sunt digni
That's a long fade. So this was just, well, you could hear the whisper you heard in the background was just an ordinary whisper, but of course you had the similar effect from the processing as well. So this was just, as I mentioned, I could have sang this thing and just recorded it the usual way, but I liked the challenge of instead singing just one note. I think it was B, if I remember right. I don't have absolute pitch, and then just playing chords on that. So it was kind of more interesting and challenging that way than just singing the voices myself. And I think this is a nice illustration of what you can do by more than one DSP, and I'm very happy that there is an option to have more than one DSP, because you can do many things. Apart from just polyphony, you can do more parallel processing that do, let's say, more things, parallel copies of what you can do on one single Continuum DSP. So if you are interested, please use that. It's a fascinating world. At this point, maybe it's time to ask for questions, because I don't have any more slides and samples here. Yes?
You can just real time with a microphone.
Yes, I could try. Now I have double microphones on me, but let's see if it works. We didn't have very much time to set this level correctly, but let's see. So I will just, if I just speak now, I don't know what it sounds like to you. Is the level okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I can keep adding more notes here. Keeping speaking. If you want me to sound one octave lower, this is what you get. Maybe it's not loud enough. I will add a bit more level here. So this is my voice one octave lower. And then, of course, I could start playing some chord. And now, if I just sing one note, I could play whatever chord I like. And it's sometimes hard to maintain one note if you play a chord at the same time. Like this, you can do whatever you like. So let's see. I don't remember what kind of polyphony I have ended up with in this case, but I mean 4, 5, 6 is no problem, because this isn't using up too much DSP resources. And you can see here actually, okay, I need to end presentation mode. I can show you what the editor looks like. So you can see 3 DSP slots being used, but that's just because how things are constructed. If you look at number 3, it's totally empty. So you need nothing else. Of course, if you want to add reverb or some further processing, you could do that in DSP3. But this one uses 2 DSPs, and I guess you could configure it so that you would have then expanded polyphony in 1 DSP if you want. Or can you even expand both of them using the third one? I'm not sure is that possible. But these are just two parallel streams doing different things. Okay, I could play some really high notes so you see. Of course, if you go too high, it will end up sounding crazy. But this is 1 octave higher. And if I play a scale like this, you can hear 1 up to a certain point. It still sounds kind of okay. But if you go even higher, it starts falling apart. Especially if you go up to 2 octaves. You can see something happened there as well. It didn't like my high-pitched voice. What message is that? I haven't seen it.
Several at once. That's pretty.
Okay.
I think that was the end of the presentation.
It was the actual end of the presentation also, so it's fine. Any further questions? Yes.
If you were to use an instrument instead of your voice, would you be able to use only 1 DSP because you don't have the vowels?
Yes. If I can accept that, okay, also acoustic instruments will sound different, because if let's say, just as you have formants in human voices, you also have resonances in the body of an acoustical instrument, and if you pitch shift those, it will also end up sounding like a different instrument.
So probably the same approach would be good?
Yes, at least for some instruments. And depending on where those body resonances are located, you may or may not be able to use this technique to make it sound natural. So it will be totally dependent on the instrument. And human voice is quite challenging because we are all very familiar with it, more so than with other instruments. And everybody can instantly spot an unnatural sounding voice. So in that sense, if you can do it with voice, I think you can do it quite well with acoustic instruments, I would expect. Lippold, maybe you have some addition on this.
Yeah, so the granular work I've done is a very different flavor, which is very pitch synchronous, and the way that I expected most people would use this harmonic manipulator, and thus the name change, is with very little randomness and very careful timing to fractional samples when you play things, and like that violin sound that you often hear played is done that way. So this is actually quite a foreign world to me, and to be honest, it works a lot better than I would have expected.
And I'm happy you added those controls, that it was actually possible to do this, because the text in the let's say 2012 edition of the instructions hinted at this being possible. So that's why I started exploring it. But of course, I didn't know what you and Ed had done behind the scenes, but it wasn't too much to figure out. So with these parameters you can see there, you can do quite much,
Yeah.
both as you explained, and then
I was
this
quite
way.
surprised last year to see that anybody had tried to do this. So.
Okay. Yes.
Would you take the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, my small little brain kind of after hello, which I understood quite nicely. Could we just maybe go back and describe how we use granular sampling here? You're using basically delay feedback to do this, because there's no real sample function in here. So how do you create the grains that you're somehow manipulating in the Egan matrix?
This is actually something that the matrix is doing on its own. So whatever is present in the delay is used as raw material for a granular synthesis. So I only need to feed my audio into the delay line and then set the parameters correctly for the harmonic manipulator, and then that will do the granular
okay.
resynthesis.
So the all-important instructions from the first version manual tell us something that inherently, internally, what's going on here, I guess.
Well, it's the live setting in the harmonic manipulator.
Okay.
Select live there.
Okay, the live setting.
And after that, you've sort of fallen off a cliff. You're on your own. But this guy.
I like
Okay.
falling off cliffs. So
I haven't used that one yet. One other question. On using the two DSPs, we're hearing the output of them both simultaneously?
Yes.
Right. So here's the question. Is it possible, I don't think it is, but are we thinking about having one DSP's output not heard, but being able to feed into, say, the second DSP?
Yeah, that's possible. Maybe you've heard some of my effect preset, and that's exactly what they are doing. You don't use the output of the DSP, feed a second one, you can process, and then you can feed a third one, and then process again, and have a...
But we can't do that right now?
Yeah.
We can?
I can give you some
Okay,
presets soon.
that's interesting.
I would like to take advantage of the last question to welcome Michel Geiss, who is with us. He's one of the main synth master in France, so I'm very happy to have him today. And so he had a question. So.
Thank you, Christophe. Listening to your presentation, I was wondering if it would be possible to extend the process to get more unnatural voices, to get kind of voice effects like what is used in modern American pop music now since some time, and extending your process to get like a formant change or other processes maybe could be a way to get the very different voices than what you presented.
Yeah, I think one thing is, of course, that if you want to go far and do fancy things, you would need some kind of analysis functions, so you could analyze the audio in real time. But that's not basically possible in this kind of matrix. It would need quite significant changes, I guess, if you could, for example, add some frequency tracking or something like that. I don't know if you, Lippold and Ed, have any plans for that, but I guess it would need some kind of specialized functions. If you let's say if you want to do automatic pitch correction, then it would definitely need some kind of frequency tracking, so that it would then generate. That would be the input for the frequency correction. Was that something similar to what you meant, or just weird processes in general?
It's not really pitch correction which I was speaking about, but transforming the voice into different kind of voices, which in modern pop music is used to double the original voice and get something different, getting away from the full natural voice. And this is most used now in many songs, many number one songs in the charts.
Well, I'm not familiar with all the techniques used. I have been doing also some recording and mastering, but not of that kind of music, so I'm very unfamiliar with what processing is. Yes.
Well, I think,
Thank you.
The exploration is to try to come up with something different that would be unique to hear, that doesn't follow what the other things are doing, something new.
Yeah, of course, this one tried to be natural, but you could also do something which deliberately far from the natural one, and also not the kind of standard already heard chipmunk effect, which you would get if you aren't careful. So something you would go in a third direction somewhere. I guess that would be perfectly possible.
Yes. Something I'm also doing is having the waveguide I was presenting just before, and I have a few presets already doing this. And I have my voice through a set of waveguides, so raising some new harmonics contents. And so that's just changing. It's not sounding as a voice, but as something different, but driven by your voice, so you can still recognize the vowels and consonants. So that's also a play field we need to explore a little more, probably. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thanks.
Well, I just had, I just had a quick observation that when Benedict, you played those audio examples,
Yes.
and then you separated out the two components and the two different types of synthesis, that psychologically, I found it hard to put it back together, the glue. And I was hearing the components, whereas when you played the first sample, I didn't hear it at all.
I had the same problem when I was
Yeah.
designing these presets, because I was never satisfied.
Yeah.
Because I always heard the artifacts.
Yes, because you're
So-
aware.
And that happens often. So I also for the piece tomorrow, the intention was to use 50% for sound design and 50% for rehearsing. It ended up being 95% sound design and 5% rehearsing. So that happens when you design sounds. I guess many people are familiar with that.
Okay, thank you very much. So, I guess it's time to thank you first, and then welcome Frédéric Rousseau, who's going to give a talk about some of the work they're giving here at IRCAM.